been talking together about the significance of real language and how real language carries ideas deep, deep, deep to the heart. Well, you can imagine that because that's God's purpose in language, that as our culture, as our world becomes more and more diffident towards God's ways, that youth literature then changes very, very dramatically. Think about it this way. The world can measure our brains, it can x-ray them, MRI them, test them, but it doesn't know what to do with this eternal spirit that's inside of us. So education and youth literature tends to focus on the measurable brain. And so the modern book has been born. And I showed this picture a little bit earlier, but I'd like to show it again. In a typical modern book, you'll see just one piece of a thing. And we're just going to have little factoids all around the perimeter that are going to teach us little superficial bits of data about one part of a whole thing. And so it's PC factoidy, same thing as I mentioned over here. Here's a seed pod. Seed pods are actually filled with vitality and power. And I mean, we could just ponder that alone. But instead, what we get is very minuscule little factoids about seed pods. And so they're, in other words, feeding our brain with measurable facts. And they're skipping the whole majesty and import and potency and significance of all these things that are being addressed. In other words, they're trying to speak just to our brains. They're treating us if we are brains with limbs attached. And we know that we're so much more. In fact, the Bible never even mentions the word brain one single time, even though it's God's most incredible creation. Instead, he says, incline to me your heart that you may receive instruction and wisdom and even knowledge. So what we want is something that targets way down in our heart. Will the brain be included and involved? Absolutely, of course. But what we first want to do is capture the heart. But a modern book like this with just a lot of factoids, that will basically only capture the brain with superficial information. And because it tends to be clinical and sterile in nature, it actually has a boring element to it. And therefore, they try to make up for the interest with large color images as if stimulating the retina was the same thing as capturing the heart. But those two things are not the same. So the reason that the data is sterile and clinical is precisely because they're trying to only speak to a physical organ that is inside of our skull. But the way that books used to be, and again, I'm going to show you the same book I showed you before, is that they are trying to actually capture the heart because they're talking about the whole forest. You'll see the difference here. We're seeing all the parts of a forest. We're seeing animals and so forth. And if we were to even read just a sample sentence here, the silence of a deep shadowed summer's day is broken only by the drone of a cicada or the silver song of a scarlet tanager. That was evocative. We were placed there. All of our being was put there. And if I were to read the whole section, you would see that it's talking about fruit and trees and mammals and insects and birds and waterfowl. It's celebrating how all the parts come together to make this symphonic whole. This whole represents the wholeness of creation. And this is exactly what is meaningful to the deepest heart of hearts. Then our brain pays attention to these things. So you can either have parts or you can have the whole. And you've probably heard the phrase that you can sum up all the parts and they will never equal the whole. And that is exactly the case. You'll notice that this book isn't separated like this one is. See how this one has all the lines around the edges, constantly partitioning, and yet this is a whole book. It flows to the next page and the next and the next. So there's a current like on a river that's just sweeping you ever onward. And this is usually when someone says, that's nice, you have a picture book. And that's because usually today the only time children experience lyrical language and real art is in a picture book. And as soon as a book becomes supposedly academic, it tends to become more sterile and fitting with the culture's concepts of education today. But this is actually a science book. When a tree falls here, it's only just a matter of pages before the saprophytes begin growing on it, returning the nutrients to the soil. And here we have the forest succession cycle, but done beautifully, lyrically, and artistically. And that is what makes these books so special and so powerful, and why we have to work hard to find them and protect them and share them with members of this library.